Welcome to Measuring Success Right, the official podcast of the Marriott Student Review, a podcast for students by students, where we connect the leaders of tomorrow with the issues of today.
Welcome to another podcast of Measuring Success Right. I'm your host today, Hunter Muse, and we are so happy to have a special guest with us today, Bianca Lisonbee. I'll read off her bio here before we get into our conversation. So Bianca was born on board an Italian ocean liner when her parents were emerging from Italy to America. The captain of the ship asked if she could be named Bianca after the ship. Because she was born in international waters, she was able to choose her citizenship between 4 countries when she was 18. She chose the United States. Bianca grew up in Arlington and Richmond, Virginia, where she joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She graduated from Brigham Young University in speech and drama and children's literature. She helped her husband, David, to start the company For Life Research in 1999. She and her husband served a mission as a couple in Milan, Italy in 2009, and she served with her husband when he presided over the Brazil-Salvador mission in 2014-2017, which I add is the best mission in the entire world, but I'm not biased. She and her husband have 5 children and almost 13 grandchildren. Her favorite thing to do is sit around the kitchen table, laughing and talking with her family and eating great Italian food, which, of course, she will have fixed for them. Bianca, thank you so much for joining us today. You and David, you've worked together through so much, serving missions, raising a family, building a business. You've done so much together, and I think your partnership resembles really strongly what a lot of us hope for in our lives, a partnership of working together with our spouses and creating a beautiful life. What have been some keys to building a great marriage and partnership in your lives?
Wow. Well, we're still building. And I think one of the most important things would be, you hear a lot about the importance of communication, but I would stress good communication, because communication will take place, whether you intend on it or not.
Right.
It can take the form of silence. It can take passive-aggressive behavior. So good communication doesn't just happen. Mm-hmm. The other forms do.
Yeah.
And I remember early on when the kids were little and David was immersed in so many of the stressors he was under, I couldn't articulate what I needed verbally. I couldn't, it was hard to even get each other's attention for a verbal conversation. So I would write him letters. He would find a letter on his pillow. He'd know it wasn't a love letter. Right. And as time has gone by, we've refined that process. Mm-hmm. But I think I would tell, especially women, because I think we as women tend to do this. We do, if you really loved me, I wouldn't have to tell you. Or if you really loved me, you would fill in the blank. And oftentimes our poor spouses, they feel like they're in a class they didn't have the prerequisite for. They don't know how to fill in that blank. And it doesn't really have anything to do with how much or how little they love you. Right. And I think we have to teach each other how to care for each other. And that's not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And as we learn to do that, we become less demanding, our expectations become much more charitable, that it's okay to let your spouse know in positive ways what is working in how you are interacting with them and what isn't working. Mm-hmm. But that takes humility, it takes courage. It can oftentimes turn into an argument when we start the initial process.
Right.
But those are arguments or discussions, I should say, worth having, because without them, there will be a buildup of unhappiness, resentment, and then it's hard to go back and say, oh, speaking of 20 years ago when you said this, So it's something we have to do while in process.
Mm-hmm.
And not be alarmed by the fact that we have to, yes, you both fell in love with each other. You both adore each other. You wouldn't have gotten married. But you have to teach one another how to translate that love into what a person needs.
That's what I've learned. I've been learning in my own marriage experience too. So but from what I'm hearing, you're saying that some of the most important things to realize as you're building a partnership is to have those charitable expectations and being very transparent in communication and in our needs. Or have you felt like there's anything else that's really helped you to work together as a creative partnership?
I think it's important whenever you're involved in the same extracurricular or career projects is to put it away. You have to, it can consume you.
Yeah.
And the fact that if one spouse needs to come home and put those things away, that's important. But if both spouses are involved in the same thing, it becomes crucial, even more so, because it can consume your life. And so you have to consciously even say sometimes, we're not going to talk about work or that project for the next few hours. Let's just enjoy the children or enjoy a physical sport together or a movie or whatever.
Yeah, so having those clear boundaries and what's...
Yeah, and don't let it consume you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, one thing I've been so admiring of your life and the things that you do, and you and David seem to have such a mission-driven life, and I know that it's very much influenced by the gospel of Jesus Christ and your testimonies and experiences in that. And so I'm curious, and I would love to know how the gospel of Jesus Christ has driven your life's work and mission.
Well, I think it is really the impetus and the guideline for everything, in that if you look at business, and we're talking here probably more to business students than, let's say, the arts, but any discipline, if you can see how it is a form of service, it changes everything. It changes the tedious parts of your training. It changes how you view the value of what you're doing and why you're doing it. I remember speaking to a group, my husband and I, about entrepreneurship. And there was a young man in the audience who had just purchased a popcorn making machine. This was actually in Brazil. And he was excited because he was going to make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And we used the example of selling popcorn in the public park. What difference would it make to you if you were doing that, if instead of seeing your goal as making a lot of money, to seeing it as making people happy in the park, strengthening families? How does that change what you do? Well, it changes it a lot. It changes how you interact with the people. It changes how you feel about the tedious parts of loading the popcorn machine or cleaning it out after. Suddenly those take on a higher purpose. And I would say whatever it is we're doing, if we can see it through the lens of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we can transform how we feel about our profession and how we execute that profession as well.
That's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I remember you also you put together a faith concert in Salt Lake I went to it while you guys were on your mission.
Yes.
And I
was
loved
jealous.
it. I know. It was so good. Is that going to happen this year? I'm just curious.
You know, we'd love to revisit that. We did it for 4 years. 2 in the Tabernacle and then 2 at the Capitol Theater. We've kind of on a hiatus with that, but haven't put the idea away. It was such a marvelous experience too. It was called the Celebration of Christ Interfaith Concert. And what a wonderful thing it was when we initially invited performers from other faiths to perform at Temple Square in the Tabernacle. Some were a little hesitant about stepping on our turf, so to speak. But what a marvelous thing to see how much we all shared in a testimony of Jesus Christ, and to express it through song and music, and the spoken word was such a unifying and edifying experience. So I hope we can revisit that again. But thank you for attending it and for bringing it up.
Yeah, I loved it, and I'm looking forward to when it comes back, because it was.
Well, you'll be the first to know. In fact, we may need to get you to perform in it. That's an even better idea.
Hey, I'm always available. One thing that stuck out to me about these experiences that you've had is you seem to not have the fear to ask for something to happen. For example, like putting together an interfaith concert at the Tabernacle. Like, that is a remarkable thing to be a part of and to produce. I know also you've been involved as executive producers of different faith-based films, like The Journey of Faith, for example.
Yes.
And I guess there's a lot we could dive into that, but one thing I'm curious about is your courage to just ask for things to happen and where that came from. Does that make sense? Well,
you know, I think I certainly am a person that's riddled with fears, and the fear of failure as well as anyone else. But again, I think it's about following your heart, and also surrounding yourself, partnering with people that are passionate about the same thing. When it comes to the celebration of Christ, I had my niece, Taryn Elkins, and a friend, Vic Devano, who all brought to the table something uniquely theirs. And so it was not that I had this great idea, it was that together we built on each other's strengths, and it led to a great place. And that's the same thing in business. One of the first things to do is to realize what you can't do. And that sounds kind of negative, but I don't mean it in a negative way, but as realizing what your strengths are and what they are not, and then finding people who complement your strengths. Sometimes we're threatened by that when we should really welcome the strengths of others. And so I think as you come upon something you're passionate about, something you want to bring to fruition, whether it's a new business or a project like a film or a concert, identify what you bring to the table and then seek out those that can share in your passion and also complement your skill set.
Wow, those are some really strong principles. And
that will increase your confidence a great deal.
That's fascinating.
I often hear, and I've often even thought myself, where you'll see someone that started a successful business with an idea that maybe you had, and you're like, oh, I thought of that. I thought of that 5 years ago. And we put so much emphasis on the great idea. But there's a lot more to success than just a great idea. It's, again, in the execution comes the building of a team that can make it happen. And so the idea is important. It's a foundational piece. But so many good ideas never come to fruition because they lack the broad-based talent and skill set of a good team.
That's fascinating. It reminds me something that you said that really struck me was how your confidence came from the humility to recognize your weaknesses.
Well,
which is interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, that there's a difference in humility and being, having a low self-confidence, because humility really is confidence in the strength of the Lord and in the strength of other people that He has blessed with other talents than you have. So I guess you're right. It is a form of humility.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I never thought about it that way. So thank you for.
You could also even
that.
compare it to the spiritual gift, a metaphor in the scriptures of the whole body, and that we can only be fully blessed when we have. The body has need of the eye, the hand, the ears, the mouth, all of us playing a different role, both in the church structure, but as well in other realms of our lives as well.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. As we wrap up, I have a couple of other questions I wanted to make sure we talked about. One is your work-life balance. You raised 5 children. I'm sure that was a long period of time of a lot of work and a lot of stress and growth. And now you're traveling the world, building a company and blessing so many with your talents. I'm curious how you've balanced your family life as well as your work and life mission goals.
That's such a great question, Hunter. I think sometimes when we think of balance, we think of giving equal portions of your time and energy to the different compartments of your life. But it's never worked that way for me. For me, it's had to be more a question of, at the hub of this spinning wheel is following the Spirit. And when we follow the Spirit in any given era and time in our life, the Spirit will dictate from day to day what demands our attention the most. During the early years of our business, for me, the Spirit dictated my family, demanded that. And so I was not able to be as involved as, for instance, as I am now. Because the circumstances, the needs in my own life and sphere of influence changed. But as I look at my husband too and think, how did he do it? He coached some of the kids' teams. He was a bishop. Again, it was, I think, letting the Spirit dictate to you when church calling will take precedent, when the children will take precedent, when your job, and that really can change on a moment-to-moment basis. And Elder Holland has a great story about that in one of his books. I don't know if we have time for that, but it made an impression on me when he was in school and working diligently to meet the career goals that he had in education. And it was a weekend where he had to work on a paper. And that was due that Monday. And his parents came into town, and they didn't get to see them that often. So this was very special. But he struggled. How am I going to spend time with them and meet the requirements of this paper? Because we all have only so much time and energy. And he made the decision to be with his parents. He said it wasn't that important of a class. It was not a class he really even needed to reach his goals. But as the time went on, the Spirit dictated to him, you need to do your best on this paper and perform exceptionally well. He talked with his wife, Pat, and they decided she would entertain the parents this time, and he would focus on the paper. Well, he turns in this excellent paper, and he comes to find out, the professor calls him in, was so impressed with the paper that he was going to share it with a colleague who was the very person that needed to open some very key doors for Elder Holland's future career opportunities. And that was such an example to me that there's no blanket, okay, family comes before school.
Yeah.
If that was written in stone, then he would have turned in a less than excellent paper. But because he allowed the Spirit to dictate in that very specific situation what should take priority, he was able to do the right thing. And so I think life is too complicated for all of us to, yes, there are certain built-in priorities, God, family, church, work.
Yeah.
But within that overarching priority structure, we have a lot of individual decisions to make sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really neat way to frame that question of how to balance your life, and that's beautiful. So to wrap up our wonderful conversation, I wish we could talk for a lot longer because so many insights that have helped me in my life. But to wrap up, we ask all of our guests the same question at the end of the podcast, which has to do with the name of the podcast, which is how will you measure, or measuring success right is how it goes. And so our question for you as students at the Marriott School of Business and then across BYU is how can we measure our lives correctly? Yeah.
Wow, what a great question. One I grapple with every day and continue to. In what terms do we evaluate our success for our mission here on this earth? And I think it's page 10 in Preach My Gospel that says how to determine if you're a successful missionary. And I love the criteria they lay out there because every one of those things is not dependent on, let's say, the number of baptisms you had or external measuring points, measuring sticks. But they're all about whether you're feeling the Spirit, whether you're growing, whether you're coming closer to your Father in heaven, whether you're getting closer to understanding the will of God in your life and increasing your capacity to do it. And that can look very different for all of us. But someone who has a very humble career in terms of financial reward could be doing that a lot better even than someone who maybe is influencing thousands of people through a very successful endeavor. And so kind of like getting back to the missionary maybe who serves in a mission that has a lot of baptisms isn't necessarily a more successful missionary than the humble servant of God who has poured his whole heart, might, mind, and strength into serving the master whom he loves. So there's a lot of factors that we can't really measure from outward measuring sticks. And as Latter-day Saints, I think we, of all people, know that the inner life is where it's all about.
Yeah.
And yes, those wonderful things going on in the inner life often translate into outward signs of what the world would deem as success, but never let us underestimate where true success, our relationship with God and His Son, Jesus Christ, our capacity to grow in understanding of what it means to understand the atonement and to access its power and grace in our lives is a very personal thing and will look different in each life.
Sister Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today and sharing your testimony of your life and your philosophy and your experiences, which are just so uplifting and wonderful. If someone who's listening might want to reach out to you and ask you more questions, is there a way that they could talk to you or contact you?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you can email me at bianca@forlife.com.
Okay, perfect. And as always, you can find our podcast on social media, on Instagram at Marriott Student Review, and also on Facebook at Marriott Student Review. And also send us an email at byumsr@byu.edu. And we would love to hear your feedback on the podcast and get your thoughts. Join us next time, and thank you so much for joining us today. Make sure you subscribe to our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or SoundCloud so you never miss an episode. Be a friend and tell a friend about measuring success right.
This podcast is a project of the Marriott Student Review at Brigham Young University. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Marriott Student Review or online at marriottstudentreview.org.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect official policy or position of Brigham Young University or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.